Hello and welcome to SFDC Sessions for the week of May 11th. My name is Elisa Carroll and I'm editor-in-chief of Henry Magazine. Last year when we decided on the concept of design in nature for our 2020 issue, little did we know how personal that concept would become for all of us. In the midst of quarantine, so many in the community have shared that they're turning to the California landscape and to their gardens for solace and for restoration of both body and mind. So this week, join us in the garden. We're so thrilled to welcome three extraordinary voices about living in the landscape. Bernard Trainor, landscape designer and the founder of Ground Studio based in Monterey, author Linda O'Keefe, and San Francisco interior designer Stacy Stone. As always, our many thanks to the San Francisco Design Center and Rhonda Hirata for providing this platform. And please do visit the San Francisco Design Center website after this broadcast for more resources and research and information on furnishing, exploring, and developing your own green room. It's such an unbelievably gorgeous time of year. And as you all know, speaking with the design community, so many people right now are turning to the landscape, right, for solace, for comfort, and for refuge, that we really wanted to have this conversation with the three of you. And one of the things that's come up most in our conversations is that when you're designing a home in relationship with landscape, that doesn't mean it has to be a literal interpretation. There just really should be some synergy. And Stacy, I was wondering if you could address that and start us off.
Yeah, I actually like to start each project thinking of it as a whole, whether it's existing house or ground up or trying to get the whole team together, but thinking of it as a whole so there is a synergy. But then as the interiors evolve, really thinking about the inside and the outside and how those two are going to have relationships from different rooms. I did a project recently in Hawaii. And actually, when the team started, we were going to have such a strong connection to the site, which was right on the beach. And it was all about that. It had been decided that was going to be the driving force. So when I started early on looking at materials, it was also with the idea that these might wrap to the exterior and go into the landscape. And so all of us, the architect, landscape architect and myself, worked together to develop that palette that was going to be really flowing in and out and be seen from the beach. The poured concrete actually became the color of the sand of the beach, and the stone floors became the color of the sand on the beach. So everything extended out and came in, and all those things were carried through the garden, through the interior, and there was a big dialogue because the exterior, actually, the site was informing so much of the building.
One of the beautiful things you pointed out, as Stacy's talking about integration, was experiential integration as well, right? So whether it is proceeding through a house and seeing, or rather feeling intimacy and then opening up into an expanse, or going, from enclosure to intimacy. Can you talk a bit about that, Linda? Because in your recent book, you spoke to so many homeowners that kind of had that pacing through their properties.
Yeah. Well, I think that kind of experience is a valid, important part of interior design and architecture too. But I think for me, it becomes even more so when you're outside, and that moment of transition. I mean, with Stacy talking about the concrete that was integrated from the inside to the outside. I think transition points are really vital from inside to outside. But yeah, the experience of, I think there's a lot more emotion when you're outside that you're dealing with. When we talk about interiors, we often link color and emotion together. And we think about, after you've established the function of a room, then you ask, well, what do you want to feel like in here? And then you talk about color and all the rest of it. Well, I think this question about emotion is really predominant when you're outside. And this is much more Bernard's sort of, territory than mine, but just the feeling of being outside is instantly transformational, whether it's because, I don't know if you can hear that I've got some pretty chatty birds behind me here, but whether it's because of the birds that you're hearing, or because of the sound that you have underneath your feet because you're walking on gravel that's just transitioned to cedar chips, or whether you lean down and you touch a leaf and it's or it has the softness of silk. There's this, it's much more about the five senses when you're outside, and that I connect to emotion and therefore transformation.
I had done a questionnaire, not a questionnaire, we were just talking at our table casually, and I had asked everyone to go around the room and state what their most memorable experience was in their entire life. Where were you? And how did the surroundings play into it? Everyone went around, all the experiences happened outside.
Mm.
They were never inside. The memories that really stuck were outside, every one of them.
Very interesting, yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was so interesting because I was trying to see what makes that imprint for people. What is memorable? And I was just sort of throwing it out there as what does make places memorable. For them, it had to do, every memory was outside.
Bernard, you said that there are so many elements of a landscape that you choreograph, but ultimately you are creating a feeling or an atmosphere.
Yeah, that's true. Well, it was great not to start and just to listen to Linda and Stacy. Because it sort of led me to things I have heard from people about experiences in their gardens as well, which are very touching, because that's why we do it in the first place, for that level of feedback of how people have experienced some of our gardens. And one thing that resonated to me is, as you were talking about Hawaii, Stacy, it led me back to my first memory of meeting you on this Carmel project we worked on together. And the first thing you ever said was, I will not be comfortable designing until I walk the streets of Carmel and understand the vernacular more, and I want to look more at stone. And it was just very interesting to hear an interior designer say that. It was almost outward focused. And just you talking about Hawaii led me back to, well, you said the same thing in Carmel, which is interesting.
Interesting, yeah.
Linda talking about emotion, it reminded me of, I want to say it was at least 15 years ago, where a client we had done a garden for came to me in quite an emotional state. She was a little teary, and I could tell she was, I don't know, she was emotional, I guess would be the best way to say it. And she said, I want to thank you for that area out further in the garden where she had gone and sat with, I provided this seating moment further out that she thought she would never use. And she said she'd had some of the best conversations with her husband in years in this place when they removed themselves from the house, where, sometimes there's just the agitation of, I need to shop, I need to stock the pantry, I need to cook, I need to clean the kids' room, we have dishes to do, are the kids doing their homework? You know what I mean? It's this hub for activity. And I guess the leaving the house and hearing the sound of birds or the rustle of leaves, or like you said, the tactile experience of touching a silky leaf. Yeah, it's just a very different experience. And you need both, right? You need shelter, and then you need, it's making me realize I think people need to become more uncomfortable. It's sometimes too comfortable in the house, and you need to leave the house and go and be out there and see what happens, because you don't know what's going to happen, really.
That's a really wonderful, I recently did an interview with the director of the Museum of Hunting and Nature in Paris, and that was one of his key points in the way that he had created the navigation through the museum. He wanted people to be uncomfortable. He wanted it not to be a traditional pedagogical experience where you're led label by label through the room, right? He wanted it to be about nature when you can expect anything. Bernard, can you share with us, how would you, I know this is obviously so different from home to home, but could you give us an example of how you might create a a path or a navigation that kind of draws someone through the landscape?
Yeah, I think the best answer to that is that it's kind of what Stacy was alluding to earlier about the team and collaboration. You're basically bringing together this group of people with different experiences and different skill sets, and basically trying to merge them all together as one thing to create one whole experience, inside and outside. Different experiences, but being led in and out, as we were talking about earlier. And so the way we typically do that is come with an open mind. We listen a lot. We talk a lot to the architect and the interior designer and the clients about the way they want to use the property. And so there's sort of this, the reason it's different on each project, I feel, is sometimes there is this level of how do we draw people into the landscape for comfort and usability, you know, such as sitting, cooking, fire, water, swimming pool, you know, there's children and activity. So there's all of those things, and simultaneously there's this incredible landscape element that's sort of either moving forward or moving back. So the way we always think of it is zones, and those zones, they're not very literal, they don't happen in lines. They sort of almost appear like jigsaw pieces. So they come forward and they move back depending on the use of the particular room in the house. So we just listen a lot about how they're going to use it, and we either bring very textured, raw, you know, dynamic landscapes and birds right to the architecture, and sometimes move it away. And it's usually, again, a collaboration with the architect and the interior designer to see where exit points are on the house. So that's a big part of it. But we do, wherever possible, try to bring these very powerful landscape moments as close as they can possibly be to the house, because I do think people have starved of that experience in today's world. It's heavily paved, it's heavily built, there's parking lot, like there's endless hardscape. So we're always trying to take wherever we can infiltrate soft textured, backlit landscape, we try to pull it as close as we can, always.
That embrace is really wonderful. I know right now, right, we all just want to feel like we can immerse in the green as swiftly as possible, right? At least personally, and avoid as much hardscape as I can, really wanting to feel sheltered. Stacy, you had shared an example of a home that you and Bernard had partnered on that was a really successful sort of model for how a designer, interior designer, and a landscape designer can work together. Would you share a little bit about that project?
Sure. We did spend some time sort of touring, like Bernard said, other homes in the area. And there is a stone there, I guess it's Carmel stone, that's quite prevalent, and this house had plenty of it. It's quite colorful and has a lot of movement. It's very strong. And so this particular client wanted more of a Mediterranean type home. And I think it was sort of this collaborative thing that we started looking at, using this sort of schmear material on the interior. But we were sort of talking to Bernard, my team and I, about the possibility of this. And it was great because we had this agreement that wouldn't it be great to have that on the exterior and quiet the stone down. So it actually became a big element in the house, outside and some inside, but it really helped us create the whole palette for the house. Was actually the problem with the house. The solution became the inspiration, which was great. We then worked together to create strong connections to the garden that Bernard had already started developing. There was no architect, so I think it was kind of nice because I worked with the landscape architect more than I typically do, because we were sort of guiding those connections together.
You know, as you start to look at what spaces you're going to create outdoors, Linda, you had the most beautiful way of describing this in your book, when you start to delineate rooms outside. You wrote, it doesn't have to be a physical structure. It can be, quote, a suggestion of shelter, a palpable sense of enclosure, or a feeling of containment, whether it's structure or is actual or implied. Can you share a little bit, maybe an example or two from your book about spaces like that you felt were really successful and less perhaps structurally delineated?
I think that sort of, it ties back to Bernard's comment about creating zones. You know, that you don't literally have to have walls, but I think that I love it when a garden has surprises in it, and I think that that's part of this kind of concept of just, you know, you turn a corner, you know, you're in a very open space, and then you turn a corner and you're in an enclosed space. You know, or I have one garden in the book that's a man who is completely obsessed with hostas. Hostas or hostas? Hostas. Getting my English accent there, but he has 400 kinds of hostas in his garden, and no walls. Just he's created these zones or these rooms just by planting different gradations of, you know, height gradations, and leaving one space empty, and then, you know, and having another space that's very, very full with somewhere to sit down. So I think it's, I think in the book I sort of say, and it may be a bit corny, but, you know, if you find a piece of moss underneath the shade of a tree, you know, that's a great place to just lay down and take a nap. I mean, it's you know, it's a temporary bedroom. You know, so I think it's I guess what I love about, and I was lucky enough to find enough gardens to include in the book. I love the personal aspects of creating landscape, and that's what comes through, I think, in the book as well, is that everybody defines a room, a zone differently. Everybody has a different requirement when they're out of doors. And I think that one thing I loved, that was such a great story you said about it, about the couple who found a much more meaningful way to speak to each other, to communicate with each other out of doors. I think nature just, I mean, I'm sure your landscaping was a big element in that, but nature just does that to you. You know, you've got all the phones ringing and the this and the Zoom meetings and then all the rest of it, and then you go outside and you're confronted with a breeze, which has just knocked over a vase of flowers here. But you know, you're confronted with nature. You're confronted with, you know, the smell of everything, the sounds. And so I also want to say that the great thing about nature is that it's a humbling experience for all of us who are control freaks and who are so involved in the minutiae of our hectic everyday lives. You go outside and it's just, none of that matters. You know?
And one of the
anyway, temporarily.
Exactly. And I know for all of us, one of the things that, well, speaking for myself, that I find so transformative about the spaces that Bernard creates is they have such an expansive feeling to them always, such an expressive feeling to them. They are like poetry. And I wonder, Bernard, how do you create a space like that feels both natural and as if it could have always been there, together with the client's program?
There might be a little bit of fear in that when I work on some of these California sites where what is already there is so beautiful and so intact, I fear that I'm going to mess that up. And I think other designers are not as fearful of that. They're more focused on what they're going to do internally and hedge it in, or which there's some great designers who do more enclosed gardens, but I think I'm always looking at the borrowed views first. Even in urban areas, I'm like, oh, I like that neighbor's tree. I might want to make sure I don't, or make sure I want to have a view towards that. I do look towards the edges. I was talking with Andrea Cochran about that once, and really what a lot of people miss in her work is she is a brilliant edge designer, as in the back of the stage, and then she does a great foreground as well. But she's really good on the edges to set the tone for what happens internally, whereas a lot of designers start designing out and then they're not quite sure what they're going to do on the edge. So I'm always, whether it's a large property or a small property, and you compliment me on saying, you know, I'm sort of like how I sort of fit in with the landscape, I'm fearful that I'm not going to do a good job and it's going to look weird with the background like that. So I'm very concerned about the borrowed views. First,
I remember you talking to me about the big Sir garden, was that you had those apprehensions, that it was just such an amazing site that, you know, and yet you needed to intervene there. You know, it needed a lot of work, but all the work that you ended up putting into it, it didn't look like anybody had done anything. It looked like it had always been there, which is so brilliant. I think that's just so brilliant.
I appreciate that, and it's a blessing and a curse, I guess, because I do get a lot of new clients, and they go, "We love your work, but we just don't quite know what you've done," which is a compliment, I guess.
It is.
Yeah, and it's a rare thing. It's beautiful how respectfully you approach a site or a project with such with such humility and respect for what is already there. There was a house today posted that was John Darian's, and I don't know, Stacy, if you find this with interiors too. He left, it's so rare that this happens, or at least that we see it, but he left all the decay floorboards, he left all of the stripped paint, he left all of these beautiful natural surfaces that usually then get polished up and painted over. And it was such a, again, just a poetic way to handle it, and such a nice way to see someone just leave it be, right?
Ah, that sounds lovely.
Well, I know our time is getting limited. I was hoping to ask you one more question, if you didn't mind, whether there's someone that influences you as you're starting to work, or how you like to incorporate landscape into your practice.
Well, I'm very lucky because I have a garden that surrounds my house, and after living in the city for so long, I've been living in a rural area for the last decade or so, and I'm very much in touch with nature. I don't literally get up in the morning when the birds start chirping, because they're really loud and noisy, and they're early wakers, but they influence me in the morning. And throughout the day, I have lots of windows in my house and access to the garden. And I feel lucky enough that my life is so connected with nature. You know, several years ago, I wrote a book about the color white, and I was writing it at a time where my house was surrounded by 4 feet of snow. And so it was as if, you know, the universe and I were collaborating, because everything around me was white. But I don't at this point think I could swap. I don't think I could go back to living in an urban nature, because I know that I'm so calmed and influenced by nature. Yeah. You know, when I'm stuck on a chapter, or if I'm stuck on a piece of writing and I can't find a way to edit it, I just can go out into the garden and weed. You know, weed, and then come back in, and all of a sudden it seems easier for me to start editing things, you know.
And you pointed out so beautifully that was essentially a physical practice of what you were trying to do with your book, right? Each is a form of editing. And Bernard, you know, if you've posted on Instagram some of your morning walks through your own garden to your painting studio, which are so inspiring. Can you share a little bit about how those have come together for you?
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey for me, because I've thought about this, and probably the first half of my career, I spent a lot of time really just looking at other people's gardens or landscape work, or other landscape architects, you know, just spent a lot of time seeing what other people were doing. And then there was a point where, I won't say I stopped doing that, but it started to transition to really looking at other things like Gerhard Richter's paintings, or Ruther Sauer's sculptures, or Derek Jarman's writing, or Mary Oliver's writing, and it just kind of goes on. So my influences are a little more like, I live in landscape almost every day. So I get inspired by seeing how a writer starts a book, how the middle looks, how how they're going to end this. Like, it's very similar to the way we design. And so I get a lot of inspiration from artists, and music is another one. So that sort of led to me realizing, wow, I've been sketching and painting my whole life, and I've kept it secret because, I was very self-conscious about it. And then I started to realize how important the painting aspect was to the way I was designing. And I started to really see the two were one thing. But I didn't want people to know about that, because I thought, well, they might think I'm distracted, or they might think I'm changing career or something, which I've never done as much landscape design work as I do now, but I also fit in the painting as well. And I think my landscape design work has improved a lot the last, I'd say, 5 to 10 years, for two reasons. One is that I have a great team, and two, because I did what I needed emotionally, which was do something else to complement this other thing I do. So.
Oh, I love that idea that you're bringing, that painting has informed the landscape work that you're doing. What a beautiful thing. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Miss Stacy?
Yeah, I think for me, this whole conversation, actually, just talking, having a moment to even think about how it is I work, and I'm realizing that the garden and the exterior are they really are just as important to me as in informing how I'm going to work the interior. I don't ever want to feel, I guess my spaces tend to be more honest and maybe a little spiritual. And I think to get there, you have to be sort of connected and grounded to the place you are.